All right, welcome to another episode of the How to Pay podcast. I'm Sipho,
I'm Elle.
And this is Amar.
and today we're going to be talking about Elon Musk and Donald Trump and how apartheid South Africa found its way into the United States in 2025. So let's start off with a brief recap, just because it's barely a couple of months into the Trump presidency and so much has happened. And I'm sure we all just want to situate ourselves in the story. So obviously Trump wins a second term as US president, which I don't know if you guys saw that one coming, but here he is once again. And this time around, he's brought the world's richest man, Elon Musk, with him as a kind of a mascot. Some people are saying, a scheming court eunuch, an untrustworthy grand vizier. How do you want to describe how Elon Musk is behaving around Donald Trump at the moment? But he's basically been in more press conferences with Donald Trump than the Vice President JD Vance has so far. I'm pretty sure about that one. And he's announced his Department of Government Efficiency.
Call it by its real name. It's dope.
No.
It's funny. It's
I
dope.
refuse
Do you
to say
understand?
that.
It's the meme. It's the meme. It's
Stop
funny.
falling
It's
for
Doge.
Stop falling for this guy's tricks. Come on.
The
He wants you
mouth
to say
kind of
stupid shit.
contorts. The mouth kind of
wants
contorts
you
when
to
you say
say
it because
Reddit
you're
shit.
cringing.
And which apparently is staffed by 22-year-old kids that he found at. Where did he get those kids? Like
They
Peter
applied
Thiel?
online.
Peter
Internship?
Thiel's casting couch.
Yeah, and he's been quite disruptive in a way that I think even small government conservatives would blush at. So the DOJ apparently is going to cut every bit of the US government that's inefficient, but it sounds like they're just cutting anything that they personally have never heard of or don't understand. And very interestingly, also pointing the finger at military contracts, which I was not expecting. But when you dig around a little bit, then it becomes obvious why. Because apparently, and his companies have something on the level of way over $22 billion in government contracts. And $22 billion is just Starlink. So apparently, they were trying to get the military to buy Teslas for some reason. So everyone was going to drive a militarized Cybertruck, which has to be the stupidest idea for a militarized vehicle. This truck that
Who's gonna
bursts
kill
into
more
flames.
US troops, the F-35 or the Cybertruck?
So yeah, basically you've got this situation where instead of, we all understand that the United States is an oligarchy. The ruling class, the wealthy run the government. They determine industrial policy, they determine defense policy. But what Musk appears to be doing is completely taking over that relationship. So there's only one oligarch now who gets all those government contracts and gets the ear of the president and so on. One of the effects of this has been in the field of foreign policy. Now, when we talk about Elon Musk and his contracts, obviously the electric vehicle industry, he has a massive interest in stopping China and its electrical vehicle industry. So we've seen a number of tariffs that are aimed at doing that. We've seen tariffs aimed at stopping steel and aluminum imports from China. But the one that has really caught the attention, at least in South Africa, has been the executive order pertaining to Afrikaners, in which basically, when you strip away the noise, Donald Trump, he wrote a previous executive order cancelling all foreign aid. It was so sweeping that they cancelled things like the National Endowment of Democracy. They cancelled funds there. They cancelled funds towards HIV/AIDS programs in Africa. They cancelled funds going to Ukraine. So places where the United States has actually been using its money as a soft and hard power tool, suddenly that was all taken away by a single piece of paper that Donald Trump wrote on. And then part of that was cancelling South Africa's participation in the PEPFAR program. So basically, the United States, up until that moment, had been funding around 17% of South Africa's HIV/AIDS treatment program, right? And then the executive order pertaining to South Africa also then creates white Afrikaners, very specific, as a separate and a new category of refugee. even though Trump had also paused all new refugee applications. So bizarre and contradictory, but suddenly race and South Africa in particular were all over the news. And I mean, this has Musk written all over it. And we're going to talk a little bit about how white South Africans are the woke DEI program that the Trump presidency wants to create and implement, even as it cancels DEI all across the United States, the government, and just society, basically.
Just quickly, they did a trial run of this in Australia in 2018. It became a real cause for the right wing to get on board with was, South African farmers, white South African farmers as a persecuted minority, need a special visa class and refugee program for them. And I mean, there's already a ton of white South Africans in Australia.
Right.
We call Perth East Johannesburg.
Oh, yes.
Because there's so
Fontaine.
Because there's so many Saffers over there. So naturally, obviously, I mean, I think if obviously Elon's South African, so it has special appeal to him, but it also just sounds like the kind of thing that a chronically online person would have picked up as well.
Yeah, it's a very Reddit kind of a thing to care about. It runs hand in hand with white people who are obsessed with Rhodesia, obsessed with the Pinochet government if they're really, really nerdy about it.
No, Elon being on Reddit? No, that's shocking to me.
The funny thing is, obviously then the State Department has to implement all these executive orders, right? The State Department has since issued a press release saying that South Africa's participation in the PEPFAR program will not be cancelled immediately. So South Africa, the only aid that South Africa receives from the United States is this HIV/AIDS money, right? So there's no other aid whatsoever. So Trump's grand gesture was immediately taken back. I mean, it wasn't even a week later. So everyone in South Africa is looking at each other thinking, well, what the hell is this? As I said, in terms of the refugee status of white Afrikaners, the immediate thing that has happened in South Africa is that countless organizations, whether it is farmers' unions and civil society organizations, cultural organizations, political parties, and so on, that are ostensibly Afrikaner or see themselves as representing Afrikaner interests, have all come out and said, no thanks, no thank you. We're not going anywhere. And there has been a minority of Afrikaners who have sort of played along with this thing. There was a rally outside of the US Embassy in Pretoria yesterday, and it was, I mean, about as close to clannish, Nazi-ish in terms of vibes that it could have got without people breaking out stiff-armed salutes, right? So it's also become very clear that this is it's not an Afrikaner issue, and it's not a white South African issue. It's very much a far right issue, and the people who thought that this would galvanize white South Africans or that there would be this mass exodus out of South Africa, aside from what has happened already, were just completely idiotic and wrong. Which is why I genuinely believe that that executive order was inspired by Musk whispering in Trump's ear, because it is such a cute misunderstanding of South Africa and white South Africans specifically, but it comes from the kind of people who are, paranoid, as we're saying, who are very much the kind of person today you'd find them on that have a blue tick on Twitter and that we're talking about Rhodesia, right? These are not people who are based on planet Earth. These are not people who are dealing with reality whatsoever. But yeah, let's talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So what is Musk's racial background? Like, is he like Afrikaner stock? Is he English stock? What's his haplogroup?
So I have to disappoint people who love the Boer joke. Musk is culturally Boer. In his heart, he is a Boer. Because, yeah, as I say, like these ideas around white genocide, these ideas around, the paranoia of certain white people in South Africa, he very much buys into all of that. But he is British. He is English on his father's side. His grandmother is from Liverpool. He does have one grandmother who is Afrikaner, but that is, I think, as far as it goes. His
that's
dad.
Really interesting. That's really interesting because I thought, like, Like, it's so funny that he talks about like white genocide in South Africa, because I thought the British like looked down on the Afrikaners.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get into all of that. I guess we can get into that right now, actually. So basically, his on his dad's side, he's English, literally having one grandmother who is an immigrant from Liverpool, and so he does have a little bit of Afrikaans on his dad's side. But his mom is Canadian, because his dad was a Canadian politician who was part of the Social Credit Party, incredibly fringe movement. Christian populist movement. So it was blatantly like a Nazi party.
Is that where the Chinese got social credit scores from?
I mean, honestly, it creepily. It sounds like what people think the Chinese social credit system is.
Which, by the way, just as an aside, I will put it out there, I support social credit. I do think that a system of social credit of like...
On certain metrics, yes. Yeah, I can have a conversation about it. So yeah, Musk's granddad moves to South Africa because he thought apartheid was that great. He thought that it was the right way for people to live. And Elon himself grows up in Pretoria, so hence also his acculturation into Afrikaner culture. So had he grown up, for example, in Cape Town or Durban, he would have been much more on the English side, I think. But yeah, he's very Afrikaner, just in terms of his presentation and his ideology. And even his accent has not worn off. People were pointing out the press conference that he did with Trump, where he had his son there. Yeah,
the human shield one.
Why he wears his son as an ornament like that. It's very weird.
People pointed out, ever since it was there were those attempted assassinations and stuff during the campaign, ever since then he started... ever since the healthcare CEO was gunned down, he started wearing his son as a human shield.
To be fair, this one is the only son that still talks to him, so...
Yeah, apparently. So, but yeah, you can still hear his South African accent when he speaks, which is very funny considering how hard he's worked to bleach it out, basically. But yeah, his dad...
Are all Boer white Afrikaners that awkward? Or is that just like the autism?
No, I think that's just Musk. They're actually quite charismatic and can be a bit much for people. Ask anyone who has to deal with Springbok fans. We're a little bit much. So yeah, that whole introverted, like looking at your shoes the whole time thing, I think that's all Musk.
Funnily enough, I had a Boer classmate when I was in high school in Bahrain. One of those classic expat stories where like dad gets a cushy job and the family comes around. But this guy, he was gay and like, very effeminately gay. He was a very charming fella, but brutally bullied for being gay. It was fucking... And like, to the extent that people were homophobic back home, like if you were like local and somewhat popular, like people are like, don't ask, don't tell. But because he was a foreigner,
right, yeah,
and had no friends, he just bullseye target on his back right there. But he was charming. I mean, his accent was a bit funny, but he was like not shy or anything. He didn't have the sort of weird autism that Elon has.
Right, yeah. Actually, in terms of bullying, that's actually what happened to Elon himself in South Africa, and knowing the culture that he grew up in, because my mom is from Pretoria, so I've been in and out of that place, and I know people who've gone to schools that have been very similar to Pretoria Boys High. I know the culture, and there's the story of how Elon was basically woke up in hospital because someone kicked him down the stairs, and that was like the culmination of the bullying he was experiencing. So he was viciously targeted, and I'm pretty certain it's because his mom was from a foreign family. I'm sure that would have been enough of a basis, because remember, we're talking about apartheid South Africa here, a society that took us versus them to its extreme logical conclusion, right? So being foreign just absolutely makes you a target. Like a friend of mine...
How did apartheid white class treat white Rhodesians? Was there like an us versus them as well there? Like, were they seen as lesser than?
Okay, so basically I think that would have played into the whole English versus Afrikaans dynamic, which kind of peeks through in Trump's executive order. So Trump specifically says Afrikaners, right? So that points to this divide and this split. So there is no like generic white South Africa. They do still factionalize depending on background. You've got people who call themselves Afrikaners, right? So these are people who are descended from Dutch. Actually, a lot of people don't know this, but because of the 30 Years' War, like a massive portion of Afrikaners are German descended, and then the French Huguenots as well. So they started coming as of 1652, when the Dutch colony was established in the Cape. 1800, the Napoleonic Wars happen, and the Netherlands is invaded by France. So, because Napoleon invades the Netherlands, the British use that as an excuse to seize the Cape Colony. And then from that point onwards, and then obviously you then have the discovery of gold at the end of that century, and then you have the gold rush, and then that becomes more people coming from the British Empire. So, more Anglo-Saxons, more Irish, Scots, Irish, etc., right? And so they split basically into English versus Afrikaner. So people who followed Cecil John Rhodes into what is today Zimbabwe and Zambia to form South and North Rhodesia are very much of the English extraction, right? Which is why, for example, the last prime minister was named Ian Smith, right? So the Rhodesians will be very much English. I'm sure you'll have Afrikaans-speaking people among them, but the bulk of them will be from the English extraction, and the ones who call themselves Afrikaners are from the Dutch and French-German extraction. So those are very important distinctions. And the boer is basically just the Dutch/Afrikaans word for farmer. So those are part of the Afrikaner people, and they actually, when the British take over the Cape Colony, and one of the first things they implemented was they ended slavery, because the Dutch colony was a slave-owning colony, and I mean chattel slavery, American style, and so that's why you have.
That's ironically
No, go ahead.
how jazz got started in New Orleans, was that the French gave their slaves Sunday off, and so they all started gathering in the park and like playing traditional music and stuff.
Right, yeah. But so that's why in South Africa today you have a massive Cape Malay influence. In fact, Afrikaans itself, the first document written in Afrikaans is a Quran that is written in Arabic script, but it's Afrikaans, and it's the Quran. So the Cape Malay people who were brought in huge quantities, people who were brought in from East Africa, from West Africa. So what today makes up what are called colored people. And this term angers Americans because in America it's a slur. In South Africa, it describes people who are mixed race and will have a mixture of traditional indigenous South Africans, people from Asia, people from all over Africa, but especially East and West Africa, so the Portuguese and Dutch colonies. And they are the people who create this Creole that becomes known as Afrikaans. Only in the last 100 years was the language taken over by a white supremacist project that turns it into the language of apartheid. So very important history that. And so please do not be offended when you hear South Africans say colored. It's not the same thing as when Americans say it. It's a very tiresome conversation to have, but for example, the rise of Tyler, the pop star, has forced this conversation on us once again, and it's exhausting. But anyway,
well, I know that in South Africa, the slur you have for is the K word, right?
So basically, the word for unbeliever in Arabic becomes so that again is a Cape Malay influence, because of course they bring Islam with them into South Africa.
Which is fascinating that colored is not a slur, but the K word, which is just basically means unbeliever, is like the N word of South Africa, essentially.
Yeah. Not everything translates. So concepts translate. So I tell people that South Africa has the same history as the United States in terms of slavery, colonialism, and it brought out the same dynamics. So for example, people who come visit here from the Caribbean will remark on how it's just the shape of the cities is the same. You can see that South Africa was built by slavery. Any case, when the British take over in the early 1800s, they abolish slavery, and this creates an exodus of Afrikaners out of the Cape Colony because they wanted slavery. And so they invade the center of South Africa, what is today the Free State province, and then what used to be called the Transvaal. So basically what today forms the northern part of the country, which is Gauteng, Limpopo, Northwest, and so on, where the mines are basically, right? And they form a couple of, Boer republics, as they call them. So the reason why one of the provinces in South Africa today is called the Free State is because it's named after the Oranje Vrystaat, which was one of the Boer republics that was formed in the middle of the country on what had been Sotho land. And so obviously there's a massive land dispossession there. And there's also a dispossession of cattle, which we're only just starting to document in South Africa, because I think land is better understood, how land was taken. But what a lot of people don't appreciate is that black wealth was also in cattle. Some kings were thought to own hundreds of thousands of cattle, and by the beginning of the 1900s, it was white people who owned vast herds of cattle and black people almost had none. So you can work out what happened there. But yeah, basically, because of gold and the discovery of gold and diamonds in Kimberley and then gold in Witwatersrand and Johannesburg, the British say to the Boers, no, sorry, we're having that as well. That's also our land now. So you have the two South African wars, and I am fast forwarding through incredible amounts of history, untold number of battles, movements of people that were on the scale of the migrations at the end of the Western Roman Empire. We're talking about the movements of tens of thousands of people, entire tribes move all over Southern Africa, and I'm just like blasting through that. So white colonialism is the engine that drives all these migrations, but it is also part of the story. So it's also mixed up in the migration. So it's a very weird time in South African history, and it helps feed into this myth about the idea that black people aren't tied to their land, because there was this massive movement of people up and down South Africa and all the way to Malawi and to the Great Lakes regions, right? Anyways, so 1902 is the end of the Second South African War, and by this time, the Afrikaners are comprehensively beaten. I mean, the British go scorched earth because in the First War, they had suffered a number of humiliating defeats, including one of them happening at a place called Spionkop. It's not far from where I grew up in the Zulu Kingdom, and so many people died in that battle. So many British soldiers died, and specifically from Liverpool, that the survivors, when they returned home, they named one of the stands at the Liverpool Football Club after the hill. So that's why today it's called a Kop. It's named after this famous battle that happened in the First South African War. And so the British say, okay, that's not happening again, right? This time around, we're burning everything. And that's where they invent concentration camps. And so they move these farmers. The basis of the economy was farming, it was agriculture, right? So while the men are off raiding in commandos and fighting the British army, another portion was sweeping up behind them and putting all their wives and children into concentration camps where they died in their tens of thousands from disease, things like cholera, for example. So obviously this causes a huge international scandal, and it even inspires organizations like the International Red Cross to petition the British government, and this effort was made to basically what today we'd understand as refugee aid, right? And it was aimed at the white Afrikaners because of how the British had completely destroyed their land and their society, basically. And it was also one of the first times in recorded history, as a result of this war, one of the first times ever that the victims were granted reparations. I genuinely don't think it had ever happened before, where the losing side is the one that basically gets given money. And so what the British government say is that, okay, you can be part of the Commonwealth, and they gave, I think, something like at the time £4 million in reparations, which would be billions today, right? And they built, so the South African version of the White House is called the Union Buildings. It's this huge, beautiful red stone building overseeing Pretoria, and it's the seat of the executive government today. That was built using British money, and I think the Voortrekker Monument, which today is this pilgrimage site for these right-wing Afrikaners, whenever they want to have a rally, they go there. And it's this gigantic brutalist monument also sitting not far from the Union Buildings in Pretoria. It's sitting on a hill just outside Pretoria, and that was also built by the British. And so they also invest in infrastructure around the country, and critically, British companies do not leave the economy. So British companies till today dominate the mining industry, for example. Anglo-American is a very prominent name in South African mining, as an example, and that's a direct legacy of what happens at that time. So in effect, the apartheid state was created for the Afrikaners and then handed to them by the British. So when you think about this, the way that some of them are petitioning Donald Trump to, quote, save white South Africans, unquote, there's historical precedence there of like a global superpower going, well, all right, we will give you your remedial white state so that you're not an embarrassment amongst the Western civilizations.
They
Was
should
that-
be petitioning Keir Starmer.
Did the English pay the reparations so that just to keep it in the empire? Was that just like to avoid like resentment or, to complete the map so that the sun never sets? Like, why were they so benevolent, I suppose, for want of a better word?
I think it was, the basis of it was basically to keep South Africa within the empire. At that time, the peak of that first gold rush was cooling off, right? But it was becoming clear that there was boundless amounts of gold in South Africa. I mean, the peak of the gold mining industry in terms of tonnage was 1986. So we're talking about 80 years before that. And so they didn't want to lose that. And as I said, as recently as 10 years ago, the bulk of mining companies in South Africa that have their legacy from British companies, a lot of them just sort of like naturalized and just based themselves here, but they still have that legacy. I mean, yeah, as I said, like quite literally names like Anglo-American. But there was also a conscious effort to sort of raise Afrikaners to the level of white civilization at the time. And this effort came from the British and it came from the Americans.
Wait, so were they saying that the Afrikaners weren't civilized?
Yes.
Holy shit.
And by the way, that divide also shows itself with this British versus Afrikaner thing that I'm talking about, right? So the Afrikaners see themselves as farmers, they see themselves as based in agriculture, and quite literally it remains Afrikaner, right? Until today, even though, most of them will live in the suburbs and they have email jobs now, they still have that self-identification with that agricultural background. Whereas the British saw themselves, miners, engineers, industrialists, the first email jobs like insurance company executives and so on.
It sounds a lot like how the North America, like the United States elite, the Northern elite, saw the hillbilly antebellum South Hicks. Like
that's
people.
Not a bad comparison at all. Yeah. And so, as I said, there was a lot of American influence in terms of this idea that white South Africans needed to be brought up to a certain level, and with the explicit understanding that they would then be used as the people who would manage and dominate the black population, right? So it was white Americans effectively like trying to see American race relations in South Africa. There was a report, and I'm sure in the United States, aside from the nerdiest of nerdy political scientists, it's pretty much been forgotten. But in South Africa, it keeps popping up and it keeps being referenced. It was written. It's called the Carnegie Report, but if you search Carnegie Report, white South Africans, you should be able to find it. And basically in that report, these political scientists from the United States come to South Africa and they look at how, in their description, white Afrikaners were living cheek to jowl with black people. They were living in like grass huts. They were subsistence farming. They had like tiny little scratches of land that they farmed, and a lot of them, if they did work in the cities, were basically like working as mining laborers, right? So they were really looked down upon. And there was this idea that no, we need to raise them up. And so, for example, there's a lot of investment in the creation of Stellenbosch University, where they say, okay, this is where we'll give like an ideological backing for Afrikanerdom. And that's the institution that takes Afrikaans away from, as I said, the mixed race people who created the language in the first place and turns it into this white supremacist project. So that's where people like Elon Musk's grandfather come in. People who explicitly see apartheid South Africa as being part of the global white supremacist project. And he's by no means the only people at this time who are traveling to South Africa in droves. One of the great ironies is that this is a time when a lot of Jewish people who are escaping persecution in Eastern Europe are coming to South Africa, and they are being re-racialized as white. So you go from being a persecuted minority in Lithuania or whatever in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you come to South Africa, and by the time your children are being born and grow up, they get rebranded as white. Which is not to say that the apartheid state and the colonial state were not anti-Semitic. Obviously they were. But it's just one of those interesting little quirks of apartheid South Africa. Right. Any case, sorry, I feel like I've taken us on a long side journey.
We're all about the tangents.
Yeah.
So basically, this is the environment that creates Musk. And what's very interesting is that, as I was saying, that there's this concerted effort to create an apartheid state in South Africa where a white minority dominate the majority African population, and they are very self-referential, and they see themselves as this sort of elite, right? And all the institutions that are created, I mentioned Stellenbosch University as one of the core institutions which are created to basically create an Afrikaner society. University of Cape Town is built by Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town as the sort of English version of it. So even today, there's this massive rivalry between Stellenbosch University, Stellenbosch is a small town just outside of Cape Town, for those who don't know South Africa. And then the University of Cape Town sits on like the mountain chain which Table Mountain is a part of. So it like overlooks the city. It has this dominant position over the city, very almost symbolic in the way that it looks. One of the institutions as well was a secret society that was called the Broederbond. And in order to be able to join the Broederbond, you had to be, Broederbond just means brotherhood in Afrikaans. So you had to be male, you had to be a Protestant, and you had to be, so you could be part of the Dutch Reformed Church, and I think you could be, I can't remember what are the other two Protestant denominations that are quite popular in Afrikanerdom, but the one that dominates is NG Kerk, which is Calvinist, and so you had to be part of. So obviously Roman Catholics are very, very recent phenomenon in South Africa, as you might tell, and so these people are found right through society. Several prime ministers and presidents in apartheid South Africa were part of the Broederbond, vice chancellors of universities, high-ranking police officers, and so on and so on. What people basically think the Illuminati is, the Broederbond actually was to South African society.
Would they let Jews in, or only if they converted?
1000% not.
I was going to say,
never ever happen.
I was going to say, imagine if they allowed Jews but not Catholics.
Right, yeah. That would be like asking
Babylon.
if
those papist bastards over there.
That's like asking if the KKK would have allowed a Jew, So basically, this idea of the secret society that is answerable to itself only and serves the interests of preserving this cultural group. Because as I was saying, it's also not ethnic. I was debating with friends, how would Trump or the Trump government try and enforce Afrikanerdom as a refugee status? And we agreed it had to be cultural, but then they'd have to specify white too, because there are many brown-skinned people in South Africa who speak Afrikaans as a first language, and they are Afrikaans through and through. They just happen to be called colored because of their skin color. Are they included in the executive order? Obviously not. So it would have to. But how do you genetically delineate someone who is descended from Dutch, German, French, from the last 300 years? But also, by the way, according to a Stellenbosch University study, well over 95% of people who identify as white Afrikaans are admixed. So it's not the one drop rule either. So
is it like if Julius Malema would sing "Kill the Boer" about you? You get to go to America now. So
effectively, yes. It depends on how afraid you are of Julius.
Because Arma's got a version ready to go. He's been itching to sing it.
No. We're not going to get banned. Not yet. Not online. We're not going to get banned.
We haven't done nearly enough episodes to get a banned. But in any case, so basically, when I look at the way that Elon Musk is approaching the Trump presidency and the way that he sees it as a naked opportunity to enrich himself, and I mean to do so quite openly. People are scratching around for parallels in history and in American history itself, to think about who could this possibly be, and they're talking about, is it like the Russian oligarchs and so on and so on. And in my mind, I think he's acting like he's the Broederbond in the United States. And I've seen some reporting about a lot of his rivals and colleagues, especially in Silicon Valley, grumbling about the fact that this guy is just muscling them all out of the goose that lays the golden eggs in terms of government contracts. So there is when we say that apartheid South Africa has sort of injected itself into the United States, it's things like these that I'm talking about, right? This anti-democratic, authoritarian, very self-referentially like white, right? So ethnic and white supremacist kind of ideology that is now the governing, apparently the grimmer worm tongue whispering in Trump's ear. And anyone who's observed the way that Twitter has taken a significant like right-wing lurch, and I mean so right-wing that it's beyond like what people would have thought is like acceptable even 10 years ago, to talk about in public, things like white replacement and white genocide as talking points now. That's just Twitter now. Well, that's apartheid South Africa. One of my core memories as a child. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Camp of the Saints. It's one of those books that.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Of course you know Camp of the Saints.
I love the way like yes.
My favorite book. Someone calling it my favorite.
So someone told me that story. So those who don't know that book, it is basically this white supremacist fever dream about a flotilla of Indians
Fever
floating
dream
across
is exactly how I would have described it.
Yeah.
Like just the delusions of a schizophrenic lunatic. Yeah, but continue.
Yeah. So the kind of a story so insane it doesn't count as sci-fi, right? So I was told that story word for word in a sort of like around the campfire style by my little white friends who were like 8, 9 years old, and this is in the context of the end of apartheid. And so I was born tail end of apartheid, and my first year at school coincided with the first democratic elections. So my childhood memories are tied up in this time of incredible upheaval in South Africa. And so the conspiracy theories that were flying around at this time were insane. White South Africans in many instances 100% believed them. And it's very important in the case of someone like Elon Musk. So think about it. He leaves South Africa in 1985 at the end of his schooling. Or did he finish high school in Canada? But it was in his teens, right? So Elon Musk is hearing these stories all the time about how the ANC is going to inspire black people to rise up and slaughter all the white people in a Night of the Long Knives style attack. So we kept on hearing that all the time. And as recently as like the mid-2000s, people were still saying that when Nelson Mandela dies, all the black people are going to rise up and slaughter us. And I mean, he died in 2012, and Obama came to his funeral. So, like, I don't know, unless I missed it. By the way, do you guys want to hear an interesting fact about...
You guys gotta work harder. You gotta...
I know,
it's not showing enough desire.
Do you guys want to hear an interesting fact about Mandela's funeral, by the way? It was the first time since the Bay of Pigs. In fact, it was the first time since the Cuban Revolution that the leader of the United States and the leader of Cuba shook hands, because Castro's brother was here for the funeral. And he and Obama shook hands, and everyone at CNN, like their heads exploded, because they were like, hang on a second, we just saw history. And it was like a very casual like handshake, and then they sat on their seats. And then a year later, Obama announced that they were restarting diplomatic relations, which then Trump took back in 2016. But yeah, in any case, times. The point is that there's been no mass attack of white people at all. There has been a significant reduction in the white population, but that's because of the number of people who left from between like 1990 and 1993. So all those like white people in Australia, for example, a huge bulk of them left around that time. And then ever since, the number of white South Africans who leave South Africa every year has significantly gone down. So those who wanted to leave largely have. And then those who made their peace with like modern South Africa and the new dispensation have made their peace. So it's a tiny, tiny little minority, a loudmouth minority of white South Africans who have the ear of Breitbart News and Fox News and the rest of the Murdoch empire. That's where the narrative around the persecution of Afrikaners was sort of incubated. That's where it grew. I'm very sure that's where Trump would have started to see it. And then once he has someone like Elon Musk pouring honey into his ear about the plight of white South Africans, suddenly it becomes like mainstream, and then it becomes an executive order that is very, very baffling to South Africans. So I personally am quite worried about what this means for the United States, because the one thing that I know for sure is that it means that issues around race and what gets put under the sort of DEI umbrella are now, not only are they going to be put on the back burner, but they're actually going to be, the culture war is going to get really stupid and really dangerous for minorities in the United States. And it's going to be driven by someone who has a background in a country that perfected segregation based on race. It took, Jim Crow South, petty apartheid, things like benches, public benches, never mind buses and things like that, and trains. Things like public benches would be segregated. So you have these famous pictures of benches in apartheid South Africa written Europeans only. So that's the country that is now inspiring America. A bizarre relationship between the apartheid South African and the United States that keeps swinging back and forth. So I am genuinely worried. I know that it can be easy to be glib about Elon because he's so stupid. He's just everything that he talks about and that he's interested in, the way that he engages on social media, he just comes across as such a dipshit and a loser. So I know it's easy to react to him that way, but he is actually quite a dangerous person. So I don't want to be clever about that. But the one thing I did want to touch on very briefly is that I think one of the things that you're going to see as a result of this attention that Trump has lavished on South Africa, which by this time next week, he'll be talking about Ireland again, or North Korea, or Japan. So I'm not that worried that he's going to really focus on South Africa and do long-term harm. There's a lot of worry around trade, because there's a specific trade deal called AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And this basically allows African countries to trade into the United States with no tariffs. So it's a way of boosting trade from Africa to the United States as a way of balancing the trade imbalance there. And South Africa was kind of let in because it's the biggest economy on the African continent. We export a lot of rare earth minerals, especially platinum and palladium, which are used in electric vehicles and other industrial processes. So even though our economy is technically too big to be included in AGOA, it's still in there because it just benefits both sides. So that has been used as this threat that has been dangled over South Africa that, well, this is something that Trump could use to damage us. Negotiation of these deals is still happening at the moment. Apparently it's supposed to renew in 2026. So let's see. If South Africa really is kicked out of AGOA, then this will be a big deal. A lot of people think that this is about retaliating against South Africa for the International Court of Justice case against Israel. And certainly there was a lot of glee from the Zionist corners of this world over this executive order, even though anyone who can read would have read that it nowhere does it mention trade, nowhere does it mention sanctions on South Africa. None of that is mentioned anywhere. So it's not sanctions whatsoever. So there's a lot of bluster over a piece of paper. But the effects that I can predict in South Africa is that, as I said at the beginning of this pod, white South Africans have largely said no. They do consider this to be their home. So I've spent this time speaking about the history of settler colonialism, apartheid, and etc., etc. Well, 1994 was a clean slate, right? So, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this process where people were allowed to come forward, and effectively, if you confessed your sins and you did so fully and freely, they were forgiven. So people came forward and confessed like the kind of crimes that would have made the SS very proud, the kind of crimes that would have, chucking people out of helicopters is mild compared to some of the stuff that people were talking about. And the deal was, okay, so let's all move forward now together. So I'm very happy personally to see that this attempt by Trump to divide people by race in my country has largely resulted in people actually reaffirming their South African identity, which is very important if this multicultural democracy is going to succeed. We really need to learn to get along and tell Donald Trump to fuck off when he tries his shit, and especially tell Elon Musk to fuck off when he tries his shit. And don't be surprised if this is a massive benefit to the ANC, because the legitimacy of ANC rule in South Africa has really been damaged, resulting in last year in the elections, the ANC lost power for the first time since 1994, and now governs via coalition. Now, it dominates that coalition, don't get that wrong, which is the reason why, largely speaking, policy has not changed, even though we now have a coalition government. It's rather unheard of. That's because the ANC still dominates, but its legitimacy has been harmed. I predict that this outside pressure coming on South Africa is going to have the effect of re-legitimizing the ANC, because they're going to be able to say that there is a strain of people who want to undo what we are trying to fix, and they want to take us back. And I promise you now, as someone who was born into apartheid, there is the idea that we would ever allow anyone to take us back is beyond revolting, and would inspire even the laziest voter to get the hell off their asses and go vote for the ANC or the EFF. So do not be surprised if
I was gonna say, I don't want the ANC to be empowered. I want the EFF to become the Bolsheviks and storm the what did you call it? The Union building?
The Union buildings, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Malema needs to be a Lenin.
Right. Well, quite like the Bolsheviks, the EFF is going through inner turmoil. People are quitting, factionalism, etc. So that's fitting, I guess.
You can tell
after you seize power, not before.
Exactly.
Yeah, we do need you to do that. It's probably going to be about a 5-part episode, but I do want the full history of Zuma and Zulu politics that you have explained to me over beers in the past.
Yeah.
Which is, I understood perfectly well until I woke up the next morning. So I need a recording now.
Yeah, it is actually worth doing a pod about one day, because the Zulu people are by far the largest ethnic bloc in South Africa, even though Zulu identity itself is very nebulous, because at the beginning of the 1700s there were a tribe of barely 400 people, and then by 1900 there were millions of people. So there's a lot of people converting culturally and so on. So it's also all very interesting. So what happens to the Zulu kingdom tends to affect all of South Africa, for better or worse. But yeah, that was the life and times of Elon Musk. And as we've been telling any American who wants to hear, you guys are more than welcome to him. We don't want him back. No backsies. Backsies.
That applies to Canada, by the way. We don't want him. You can keep him.
Yeah. Hey, look, I mean, I live in America. Australians, I think Australians would be the ones that would be the net beneficiaries of any white South African farmer refugee laws in America. Because if anyone's going to move, they probably would.
Oh, you mean from Australia?
Yeah, the Australia. Everyone was like, right. Oh, great, we can depopulate Perth finally.
Did you see that there was a oh man, I'm gonna forget who it was. Some low-level American politician who basically blurted out that they thought that the white Afrikaners could replace the Latino casual workers. So
That's so great.
Yeah,
doing race science, but just to turn them into just a new worker class.
If you look at their skull size and the size of their hands, they are perfectly suited to labor under the sun in fields of cabbage and avocado and so on.
I just imagine telling a person who has a 3-bedroom house with a swimming pool in a country where It's basically like, okay, for South Africa gets fucking freezing cold, as anyone who came here for the World Cup would have told you. But it's like beautiful otherwise. Some of the most gorgeous land anywhere on earth. And you say to them, hey, would you like to go be a casual worker on a farm in Arizona? Would you like to replace Jose?
Yeah, would you like to go and line up out the front of Home Depot every day and just have American labor bosses just come past and say, how much do you charge an hour, and jump in my truck for the day?
Whew. All right.
Thank you for listening to Hell to Pay. Please subscribe, like, share, tell your friends, and stay tuned for more.